An older man applied for a janitor job. They mocked him for not knowing how to use the time clock. They bossed him around like trash from the system. But what they didn't know was that the man they were looking down on once owned the entire building. And then that very man, in worn-out shoes and with nothing but a mop, would expose the entire leadership with just a notebook. This isn't a story about power. It's a story about dignity and the price of underestimating the quiet ones. Louisville, Kentucky. A chilly Monday morning in autumn, with the air carrying a touch of gray from a sky drowned in light mist. Outside the main gate of Helix Robotics, a towering robotics manufacturing plant, an older man stood fumbling with a paper badge in his hand. He wore a faded beanie and a dark gray jacket, his face squinting at the digital check-in instructions, then glancing at the automatic gate, which refused to open, even after 3 swipes of the card. "Dude, what are you doing?" A dry, youthful voice came from behind. A young security guard approached, holding a Starbucks cup, raising an eyebrow through his tinted sunglasses as if staring at a bad joke. "This gate uses NFC badges, not these. Whatever that is. Where's your employee app login?" The man scratched his head, visibly unsure. "They just told me to show up. Something about temp replacement for night janitorial staff." "No login?" "No access. That's protocol," the guard stated firmly, then motioned for him to step aside, dismissing him like a minor inconvenience. The man said nothing. Silently, he pulled out a flip phone, almost extinct at this point, and dialed a saved number. A woman's voice answered, "Janitorial services, how can I help?" He spoke softly, just loud enough for himself to hear. "Yeah, it's Thomas. I'm at the gate. They said someone would be expecting me." Less than 2 minutes later, a middle-aged woman with brown hair, wearing a silver-gray uniform jacket, jogged out from a side door near Building B. "Thomas?" she asked. He nodded slightly. "Come in. Sorry about the mix-up. The security guys never really adjust well to non-corporate hires." She led him through a long hallway where fluorescent lights reflected off polished tiles. He walked slowly, observing framed photos on the wall that documented Helix Robotics' journey, from a tiny garage in 2008 to today's high-tech megafactory. "You'll be covering the West Wing tonight. Mostly maintenance rooms, some storage, low traffic. Should be easy," she said quickly as she handed him a set of keys. "And watch your step. Colin, the night shift supervisor, he's a bit particular about new hires." Thomas said nothing. He just nodded, took the keys, and walked into his first shift at a place that once bore his name, though now no one seemed to know. The area known as the West Wing was far from the sleek image of a modern factory. It was a graveyard of outdated test equipment, supply storage, and employee break rooms, where the lights flickered and the air still carried traces of old chemicals. Thomas began by collecting trash bags from component storage rooms, stacking them neatly on his cart. As he bent down to mop the floor near the maintenance elevator, a male voice called out from behind, "Hey, you missed a spot!" Thomas turned around. A tall young man wearing a company-issued jacket with a name tag that read Colin B. stood with his arms crossed and a mocking expression on his face. "You're new, huh? I can tell. You're not exactly keeping up with our efficiency standard." Thomas remained silent and continued mopping. Colin stepped closer, standing directly in front of him. "Let me be clear. We don't have time to babysit retirees here. This isn't your average school janitor gig, all right?" Thomas looked up, his eyes calm, but said nothing. Colin smirked. "Did you even finish high school, man? Or did you just slide into this job from the nursing home?" Some employees passed by in the hallway, glancing at the scene, but said nothing. It was as if they were used to Colin running the night shift through fear and ridicule. Thomas picked up the mop and pushed his cart forward without saying a word. Not because he was weak, but because he'd heard those words before, not as a janitor, but as a founder, when the very board of directors once questioned, "Are you still fit for a company growing this fast?" As night fully settled, the factory was left with only the familiar hum of automated lines in the East Wing and the soft noises from the ventilation system. Thomas cleaned a small room next to the main engineering bay, filled with boxes of spare parts and old blueprints. On the wall hung a photo of the engineering team from 2010, 14 people, with one young man at the center holding the very first circuit board the company ever tested. Thomas stopped. He stood there for a long time, eyes fixed on the photo. His gaze wasn't nostalgic. It was the gaze of someone returning to the scene of an unresolved crime. In the corner of the room sat an old wooden chair with peeling paint, the same chair where he and the early engineers once stayed up late brainstorming. Now it was used to hold a broken vacuum. Thomas gently dusted off the photo frame, then ran his hand along the wooden border as if trying to feel time through his fingertips. Footsteps echoed from the hallway, quick and deliberate. Another janitor, a strong but weary black man, entered the room and sighed. "Hey, you the new guy?" Thomas turned around and nodded. The man extended a hand. "Andre, I'm on East Wing. You must be the poor soul they dumped here." Thomas shook his hand. Andre looked at him for a moment. "You used to do this kind of work before?" "Long time ago," Thomas replied briefly. Andre shrugged. "Doesn't matter. Out here, they treat you the same. You could be a damn astronaut. If you wear gray, you're invisible." Thomas didn't respond, but inside him something stirred. Invisible. He once thought he'd never need to come back here. But now that very invisibility had become the only key left to understanding how far his company had drifted. He was no longer a CEO, no longer a celebrated founder. He was just Thomas, the night shift janitor. And from that lowest place, he was about to rewrite the entire story, one stain at a time, and one forgotten word at a time. 2:37 a.m. Outside the Helix Robotics factory, the night was pitch black, pierced only by the pale glow of a few street lamps casting cold light on the concrete pavement. Inside, the West Wing still echoed with the dull whirring of an old vacuum and the clattering rhythm of a scrub brush scraping against the metal-tiled floor. Thomas, with his mop and familiar janitor's cart, was working his way through the most forgotten hallways, places most daytime employees didn't even know existed. The dark rooms, doors marked "Do Not Enter," and the faint mildew wafting from old air ducts all created a separate universe, like a forgotten basement beneath a technological castle. "You know something?" Andre said as he pushed his cart, eyes flicking into a storage room. "I've worked here 11 months. Not once have I been to the third floor. That's where the higher-ups are. Real coffee, chairs that glide like velvet." Thomas didn't respond. Andre chuckled dryly. "Yeah, you strike me as the listening type, huh?" Thomas gave a small nod, never pausing his work. Andre shrugged. "Me, I talk. Gotta talk, or I'll go insane." They reached a secondary engineering room, home to broken circuit boards, outdated robot components, and sealed-up junk no one cared to check. The floor was caked in dust, the walls stained with patches of old paint. Clearly, this was a place people intentionally ignored. Andre took a deep breath, then exhaled hard. "I asked to get this room cleaned last month. You know what they said? Not necessary. But last night, a young engineer slipped on some leaking machine oil from an old pump, fractured his wrist, and now it's been delegated to us." Classic Thomas silently eyed the black oil stain still seeping into the cement. He crouched down and began blotting it up bit by bit with a rag, as if trying to wipe away the indifference of an entire system. Andre sat down on a box of components nearby and rubbed his shoulder. "You're older. Why are you still doing night shifts? Don't you have kids?" Thomas answered softly. "I chose this job." "Chose it?" Andre raised an eyebrow. "Chose to clean the crap everyone else avoids? Chose night shifts where nobody says thanks?" Thomas didn't explain. The reason he was here, it wasn't time to say it yet. He knew that to see the truth, he had to get past the masks. And nothing peeled back a mask faster than living in the role most people look down on. After finishing the engineering room, they moved toward the electrical maintenance wing. Many staff joked about it being the forbidden zone, where the lights flickered, doors jammed, and the HVAC system moaned like someone whispering behind you. Andre glanced around, then gently pulled Thomas into a blind spot, just out of the camera's range. "Let me tell you something. About 3 months ago, there was this girl named Natalia who worked night shifts here. Hardworking, quiet, clean like a pro. Then one day she's gone. Turns out, Colin fired her for non-cooperative attitude." Thomas furrowed his brow. "Attitude? Just because she suggested the floor-cleaning chemicals were too strong, it could knock someone out in a closed space. That's it. Colin doesn't like being corrected. And management? They only hear one side. Andre looked around again, then added, "Those monthly employee evaluations. You think anyone like me or you is ever mentioned? Every time we file a report, it's like shouting into space." Thomas bent down to pick up a piece of exposed wire and set it aside. In a small notebook, he jotted a note. Maintenance wing, exposed wiring, fire hazard. Page by page, the notebook thickened through the night. These notes weren't for reporting. They were for remembering. Every small detail, every scrap of evidence from a system where injustice had become standard. The night shift ended at 4:30 a.m. Andre stretched and yawned like a man waking from a long dream that no one ever asked about, whether it was good or bad. Thomas washed his hands in a small restroom near the delivery dock, the icy water snapping him into a memory he was still trying to keep buried. In the mirror, he saw himself. Graying hair, deep-set lines, eyes that no longer held the fire they once did. But behind those eyes was a chilling clarity. He was no longer Thomas Wakefield, founder of Helix Robotics, the man who once stood on TED Talk stages to speak about the future of artificial intelligence and human accountability. He was just Thomas, the night janitor, the one the supervisor had called a dinosaur. When he stepped outside, dawn was beginning to break. A new day, but the same old system. No revolution happens overnight, but he knew real change doesn't start with speeches. It starts with wet shoes, calloused palms, and the courage to stand at the bottom and look up. Not to idolize, but to see who's been stepping on others to stay there. And on that very first night, he had already seen enough. It was only the surface, but even the surface was cracking. 2 p.m. the next day, and the sky over Louisville remained as gray as an instrumental track stretched on for too long. Thomas sat inside a small cafe next to the industrial complex, just 3 blocks from the Helix Robotics factory. The cafe was old, its wooden tables scratched, and the coffee machine wheezed like it was struggling against time. But Thomas didn't choose this place for the quality of the coffee. He came because this used to be a refuge in the early days, back when he and the founding engineers worked into the late hours, before Helix even had its first office. Inside, almost nothing had changed. The exposed brick wall still bore remnants of a 2009 Tech Fair poster. The cloth-padded chairs were still flat and creaked loudly whenever someone sat down. But what made Thomas stop in his tracks was a small photo taped to the corner wall near the counter. A picture of a young group, drenched in sweat but glowing with bright eyes, standing proudly next to the very first Helix robot. The one that had won the statewide tech exhibition. He stood and walked closer. In the photo, he, back then known as Tom Wakefield, stood on the far left, wearing a plaid shirt, beaming, holding a remote control. Behind him was Miguel, one of the first Mexican-American engineers on the team, always laughing and speaking to everyone with eyes like fire. And there was Dana, the first person to design the robot's control interface, who later became head of the software division. It was a small photo, but it carried the weight of an entire past. Thomas ordered a black coffee, sat at a window-side table, and opened his notebook. He began sketching a diagram, not a technical one, but a diagram of people. A circle in the middle read, Helix, 2008. From there, he drew branches. Miguel, no mention in company records for the last 3 years. Dana disappeared after the company IPO. Philip, former hardware department lead, who once said, "I'll never leave this place if Tom's still here." And now, not a single one remained. A whole generation that built the foundation of Helix had vanished as if they never existed. No articles, no archive profiles, no names mentioned at company recognition events. He sat there for nearly 2 hours, just writing, drawing, and connecting names and timelines. When the sun began to set behind the distant warehouse row, Thomas closed the notebook, paid his bill, and walked back toward the factory. That evening, as his shift began, Thomas decided to stop by the data archive section, what Andre jokingly called the place where memories go to die. It was their way of referring to the company's internal storage room, where hard copies of old contracts, pre-digital personnel files, and unsubmitted reports lay buried. The archive sat adjacent to a lower sub-basement, protected by 2 layers of steel doors and a rusted access panel on the side. Thomas tried the side door. It had been broken for years, but who cared? Inside were hundreds of cardboard boxes, stacked through the decades, coated in thick dust. No guard, no camera. According to new policies, all old files were no longer legally relevant. Wearing gloves, Thomas quietly opened each box. He found the original employment contract of Miguel, employee number 004, terminated for failing to meet technical standards after the company received Series B funding. But anyone who had worked with Miguel knew. He designed the first mechanical frame that allowed Helix robots to climb stairs, a breakthrough that had turned heads across the industry. So why was he cast aside so easily? Thomas kept digging, following Dana's records. No resignation letter. Only an internal memo that read, Dana L., dismissed under personnel restructuring recommendation, June 2016. No thank you, no farewell. Just a cold full stop for a mind that once helped shape the future of technology. Near midnight, Thomas discovered a file box labeled faintly, Staff Transition, 2014 to 2017. Inside, he found something that made him freeze in place. An internal memo titled Restructuring Plan for Foundational Staff, version 3.2. The content wasn't long, just a few pages, but enough to expose the truth. After receiving funding from Nexus Capital, Helix began gradually eliminating founding team members who no longer fit the modern tech company image, specifically listing staff whose profiles are unattractive to media and investors. Thomas sat down on the cold concrete floor, holding the paper, hands trembling, not from rage but from confirmation. Confirmation that what he'd suspected for years, the mass disappearance of those who once built Helix, wasn't a coincidence. It was calculated, cold, strategic, dressed up in the language of efficiency management. He tucked the document into his inner jacket pocket, left the archive room, and returned to the engineering wing as if he'd never been anywhere else. But in his eyes, for the first time in years, there was the glow of an old flame reignited. On the way back to the break room, he passed by the top employees of the month board. Colin's face appeared 3 times in a row, grinning in a crisp suit. On the opposite end of the hall, under flickering lights, hung a temporary schedule for part-time staff. No pictures, no bios, just scrawled words in marker. Thomas, Tech Wing Cleaning, night shift. He looked at the board, then turned away and walked on. But inside him, a decision had already been made. This wasn't just a job. This was a return to uncover what had been buried in moldy files and silent corridors. Wednesday night. A freezing wind swept through Louisville, but inside Helix Robotics, the chill was of a different kind. Thomas had just stepped through the doorway of the engineering wing when hurried footsteps echoed behind him. "Hey, you!" The familiar voice rang out, flat and sharp like a slap. Thomas stopped and turned. Colin was approaching, both hands in the pockets of his Helix jacket, a smirk on his face that didn't bother hiding the contempt beneath it. "Thomas, right? You've been wandering quite a bit. I saw you near the data vault last night. That area's off limits to janitorial staff." Thomas met Colin's eyes directly, unwavering. Door was open. "I just cleaned what needed cleaning." Colin raised an eyebrow, stepping closer, now barely a foot between them. "That's not your job. Your job is to mop floors and keep quiet. Got it?" Thomas didn't respond. His silence only made Colin more irritated. The younger man glanced around, then lowered his voice. "Listen, I don't know what you think you're doing, but you're a temp, and temps don't get involved. I don't want to see your face outside your assigned wing again. We clear?" Thomas kept his gaze steady. "Crystal." Colin hesitated for a beat. Something in Thomas's tone threw him off. Maybe it was the absence of fear in his voice. Maybe it was the quiet confidence, like someone who didn't belong here, yet knew every corner of this place better than he did. Colin took a breath, then turned and walked away, tossing one last line over his shoulder. "You're being watched." Thomas watched him go, then bent down to continue mopping the corridor floor. But in his mind, every step he took had a purpose. That night, he shifted his cleaning route to the employee break room, an area usually left unchecked by management. There, he heard more than any internal report could ever record. A group of young engineers sat eating late dinners, quietly whispering, "You heard about Linda?" "Yeah, I heard she got written up for lowering team morale, just because she mentioned the hallway lights have been out for 2 weeks. I swear, if I so much as cough, I'll get a suspension notice tomorrow." In another corner, a logistics worker named Carlos, whom Thomas had helped push a parts crate on his first day, was speaking softly on the phone. "Mom, I'm okay, but they cut my overtime pay. I think I'm going to look for something else. This place isn't what it used to be." Thomas passed by without changing expression, giving Carlos a slight nod in greeting. Carlos smiled back, eyes tired. Thomas had seen that look many times before, the look of someone still trying to believe their job was worth the sacrifice. At the end of the shift, Thomas visited the storage area for protective gear. He pretended to check mop supplies but was really studying the assignment board. Something odd stood out. The shift list wasn't updated automatically, despite what the company claimed. Instead, someone handwrote it and replaced it nightly, often shuffling the schedule at the last minute, mostly to ensure that undesirable types never shared the same shift. It was a subtle form of isolation. Near 3 a.m., while heading back to the engineering wing, Thomas crossed paths with Linda, a middle-aged woman with silver hair and a firm stride despite her worn shoes. She was mopping the floor, shoulders slightly hunched, but her movements remained sharp. "You're the new guy, huh?" she asked. "They put you in the West Wing? Then there's no doubt." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "No doubt about what?" Linda gave a dry chuckle. "They only put people in there when they think they won't ask questions." Thomas didn't answer. Linda looked at him a moment longer, then continued. "I've been here since the day this Helix branch opened. Back then, every employee knew each other's names. Now, that young punk who just became supervisor, he once told me, 'Stop living in the past, lady. Who even are you in this ecosystem?'" Thomas nodded slightly. "And what did you say?" Linda smiled a little sadly. "I said, I'm the janitor in the place built by a dreamer. And I keep cleaning because I still believe that dreamer hasn't disappeared." She looked at him again. Longer this time. The look of someone who'd seen something familiar. Thomas gave her a small bow, then walked on. Linda stood there, watching him for a while. Early the next morning, Colin called an unscheduled night shift meeting. Over 20 sleepy employees sat scattered across the break room, their dazed expressions sharpening into tension as Colin walked in, clipboard in hand. "I just received a report about someone accessing the data vault and protective equipment storage without authorization. That's a level 3 violation." He scanned the room slowly, eyes settling on Thomas in the far corner, still holding a paper coffee cup. "I hope no one here thinks they can go snooping around the company's business. We don't need heroes. We need compliance. And if anyone here feels they don't belong, door's right there." No one spoke, but the air in the room grew thick. Thomas placed his coffee on the table and stood up. All eyes turned to him. He walked over to the assignment board, picked up a marker, and clearly wrote his name into the night shift slot, darker and bolder than usual. Thomas, Engineering and Storage C, voluntary. No one knew what he was doing, but a few nodded faintly. From the back of the room, Andre smirked and said under his breath, "Let's see how far he'll go." The first confrontation had happened. No shouting, no punches. But it planted something in Colin, a feeling he had never experienced before. Doubt. Doubt about the identity of this older man, the one who wasn't afraid of threats, who didn't flinch before authority, and whose eyes didn't belong to any janitor he'd ever known. That afternoon, a light rain fell over Louisville. The droplets tapped gently against the glass window of a small auto repair shop on 8th Street, forming streaks like a watercolor painting. Thomas stood beneath the awning, holding his worn notebook, eyes fixed inside, where a middle-aged man was crouched fitting a new tire on an old pickup truck. The man's name was Miguel. Thomas waited until he saw Miguel wipe his hands and step over to the counter for coffee, then quietly walked in. "Excuse me," he said softly. Miguel looked up, slightly guarded, but his expression softened the moment he saw the face in front of him. "Tom?" Miguel said, stunned. "Tom Wakefield? Is that you?" No need for confirmation. Thomas's faint smile was enough. Miguel stood frozen for a few seconds before stepping out from behind the counter and pulling Thomas into a tight embrace. I thought you were gone, vanished. We heard rumors, but Miguel hesitated, then looked Thomas up and down. What the hell happened to you, man? You look like you've been through a hurricane. Thomas gave a small laugh. Because I have. I just didn't realize I was in one until it was too late. They sat down at a plastic table in the corner of the shop, the place Miguel used to receive customers. Beside them was a whiteboard listing oil change and engine tune-up prices. The lettering faded with time. Thomas opened his notebook and placed a printed document from the archive onto the table. It was the 2016 restructuring plan. Miguel glanced at it and clenched his fist. So they finally made us disappear. Officially. Thomas nodded. Not just you. Donna, Philip, Jenna, all of you. Miguel leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. You know, I gave everything to that company. My weekends, my marriage. I believed in what we were building. And then one day, I wasn't strategic enough. I wasn't the right face for a press release. He gave a bitter laugh. They gave me 2 weeks severance. No thank you. No goodbye. Just a locked email and a security escort. Thomas said nothing. He knew Miguel's story wasn't an exception. It was the new standard in a system that measured people by their media image more than their contributions. Why didn't you speak out? He asked. Miguel looked at him, voice thick with bitterness. Because I thought you left us. I thought you cashed out and ran. Thomas straightened his back and looked his old friend in the eye. I never ran. They forced me out. They told me the board had voted, that I was holding the company back. Miguel nodded slowly. That explains everything. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. When Thomas left the shop, he left behind the printed restructuring plan and a handwritten note. Not forgotten. Not done. That evening, Thomas returned to the factory. His shift began as usual, but something in the air felt different. Andre approached him, speaking quietly. Something's off. Linda's been temporarily moved to Zone C. Some new guy just got fired for misuse of equipment. They're doing a sweep. Thomas gave a slight nod. He knew this wasn't coincidence. In the engineering wing, Thomas found his janitor cart had been tampered with. Some of his tools had been swapped for broken ones. The mop handle had been sawed shorter. Taped to the grip was a small note. Stay in your lane. He peeled it off, placed it in his pocket, and said nothing. But his eyes began to change. Around 2 a.m., he walked through the corridor between two production halls. The lights were dimmer here, the cameras mounted at odd angles, and no one ever passed through. He heard whispers, then soft footsteps, too soft to belong to a fellow night shifter. When he turned, he caught only the silhouette of someone slipping behind a corner. Andre came jogging from the other direction. You all right, man? Thomas nodded. I think someone's following me. I know, he added quietly. Thomas didn't flinch. He wasn't afraid. He was simply more certain now someone wanted him silent. The next morning, just as he was preparing to leave the factory, Thomas found an anonymous note tucked inside his locker. It was just a plain A5 sheet, unsigned, with one handwritten line. There's more than you think. Meet me by the old container yard after tomorrow's night shift. Bring what you found. He folded the note and slipped it into his pocket, then turned to glance back at the factory, as if for the first time in 10 years, he no longer saw it as his brainchild, but as a fortress, gleaming on the outside and rotting from within. He wasn't afraid. He wouldn't back down. He wasn't in a rush, because people like him, once they return, they don't turn back. 11:58 p.m. A cold wind swept across the back lot of Helix Robotics, cutting through the rows of abandoned containers once used to store discarded robot components. This area had long since been removed from the company's operational system and had no surveillance cameras, just a dim, silent void where whispered voices never made it into official records. Thomas arrived at the meeting spot, holding his thick notebook and a printed copy of the Personnel Restructuring Plan 3.2. He stopped between two rusted containers, standing tall, eyes scanning the dark corners. No one appeared. The wind howled through the metal walls, sounding like voices struggling to speak but forever unheard. 5 minutes later, a man emerged from the shadows. He looked to be in his early 40s, short cropped hair, worn hoodie, slouched shoulders, but a sharp and purposeful gait. "You're Thomas?" the man asked without offering a name. Thomas nodded. The man extended his hand. "I'm Eric. I used to be a software engineer on Dana's team. Now I work logistics at a transport company. But I remember everything." Thomas didn't shake his hand but kept his gaze steady. "Why did you ask to meet me here?" Eric looked around, then pulled Thomas to sit on an empty wooden crate. "Because Dana didn't just disappear like you thought. She was silenced." Thomas didn't blink. Eric continued, his voice low. "In 2017, after Helix received funding from Nexus, Dana discovered the company's AI system had been modified to skip safety checks, just to speed up production lines. She sent an internal email demanding an investigation. 3 days later, her account was locked. A week after that, she was forced to sign a voluntary resignation. But before she left, she sent me a backup file, source code, and a recording of her meeting with the board." Thomas gripped the notebook tighter. "And where is that file now?" Eric pulled a small USB from his jacket pocket. "I've held on to it for years, never dared to use it. But when I saw you show up, walking around like a ghost, I knew. Maybe it's time." Thomas took the USB, his expression unchanged, though a weight settled in his chest. This wasn't about isolated abuse of power anymore. It was a coordinated plan to erase those who knew too much and wouldn't stay quiet. Eric looked at him for a moment longer. "Thomas, you used to be a symbol for us. You believed that technology must walk hand in hand with ethics. We all hoped you'd uphold that." Thomas answered softly, "I was too late. But I won't let them rewrite history." Eric nodded. "I won't contact you again. But if you ever need a witness, I still have the original files." Their meeting ended in silence. When Thomas returned to the factory, the neon lights in the main hallway still glowed with their cold, sterile brightness. He stepped into the engineering room and plugged the USB into an old laptop Linda had left behind. On the screen appeared a folder, Phoenix/Dana_root. He opened the first audio file. Donna's voice rang out, clear, firm, powerful. "I can't stay silent knowing our AI system is having its final error detection layer removed. This isn't just wrong, it's criminal." Another voice responded, clearly a board member. "Dana, you're making this bigger than it is. You're an engineer, not an investor. If you don't want to continue, we can arrange for a smooth exit." Thomas stopped the recording. He closed his eyes for a few seconds, not to rest, but to remember. To remember the last time he sat in that same boardroom when they told him, "Your vision no longer aligns with market trends." He had walked out silently, believing the company would eventually correct its course. He had been wrong. That night he wrote a new report, not addressed to the current board, but sent to a special internal address only a founder would know. Echo Server, a secure HR feedback loop encrypted back when he was still CEO. Though it hadn't been used in years, he had never shut it down. He attached the audio file, the 3.2 restructuring plan, and a brief message. "A company cannot survive if built on silence and amnesia. I have returned." After sending it, he stepped out into the hallway and stood before the outstanding leadership photo display near the elevator. In the photo was Brent, deputy HR manager, the same man who once smiled while signing Dana's voluntary resignation paperwork. Next to him was Kyle, operations director, who had once said, "We don't need people who understand the core. We need people who follow." Thomas stared at each face, then turned away. In the darkness, his footsteps echoed, not those of a janitor, but of a man who once built it all with his own hands and was now preparing to overturn the entire system. 6:47 a.m. The back door of the Helix robotics factory closed behind Thomas with a dry metallic clack. The sun hadn't risen yet, but something inside him had already begun to move, not from light, but from data. On bus route 42 heading north through Louisville, Thomas sat in the last row, a small laptop on his lap. The screen displayed green command lines. Echo Server initialized. Standby for response. Message status. Delivered. Recipients, 8 legacy accounts. He knew the Echo system was a technical ghost. No one on the current board even remembered it existed. But when he was still in charge, Echo had been created to collect anonymous feedback from frontline employees, completely bypassing upper management. It was the only channel the founder could use to hear the truth from the lowest level. Since being ousted from leadership, Thomas had never used it again, until now. That afternoon, instead of returning to his usual coffee shop, he stopped by a secondhand bookstore to access public Wi-Fi. He reopened the system. On the screen, a blinking message appeared. One new message, user ID LH417. Thomas opened it. It was from Linda. I don't know who you are or how you got into this system, but if you are who I think you are, then welcome back. I used to believe no one cared about us anymore. If you want me to tell you everything that's happened since you disappeared, I'm ready. Just promise me this time, you won't give up halfway. Thomas quickly typed his reply. I'm not giving up. I came back to finish what I left behind. By that evening, as his shift began, Thomas returned to the factory with a folded note in his pocket. A list of the 8 legacy system accounts still linked to Echo. All belonged to former employees. Most had resigned, been fired, or vanished during restructuring rounds. But the system still recognized them. A few still used their old emails, if only to check in on memories. Thomas picked 3 a.m., the hour when most people were drowsy and distracted, to quietly tape a small sheet of paper in the technical wing's restroom just behind the door. It contained only one bold sentence. You were once part of something greater. It's not over. Beneath that line was a QR code linking to the Echo server address, encrypted in a way only former users would know how to decode. No one was forced to read it, but those who'd been forgotten would feel its pull. That same night, Thomas ran into Linda in the break room. She didn't ask questions. She simply placed a small wooden box in front of him. I've kept this since 2017. No one dared touch it because no one knew what was inside. Thomas opened it. Inside was an original personnel file, roughly 300 pages thick. The cover was handwritten, Dana L., Dispute and Documentation. Inside were internal memos, feedback logs, and, most importantly, emails Dana had sent to Brent, the HR supervisor, warning about ethical violations in the AI quality control system. One reply stood out. We appreciate your concern. However, this is not your area of expertise. Thomas closed the file. The connection was now clear. 3 days later, Thomas received 2 more messages through Echo. One was from a former facial recognition software engineer, now freelancing in Indiana. The other was from Jenna, ex-head of the testing team, who had been pushed out after discovering technical errors deliberately concealed. Jenna's message read, I once believed Helix would be the place I gave my whole career to. I left quietly because no one wanted to listen. If you truly want to bring light back, know that we're still here, just waiting for someone brave enough to speak. Thomas could feel the old current rising again. No slogans, no fanfare, just a single pulse and faith. On Saturday night, during a rare internal meeting organized by Colin and attended by both Brent and Kyle, the air was thick with tension. Brent stood and announced, We've received information that the Echo system, previously decommissioned, has been reactivated. This constitutes unauthorized access to internal data. Colin's eyes cut toward Thomas, razor sharp, and someone on the night shift clearly overstepped. Thomas stood silently in the corner, observing. No reaction, no defense. Because he knew the eyes on him weren't those of captors catching a thief. They were eyes beginning to fear. Fear something they thought had been buried for good, but it had returned, with names, memories, and evidence. After the meeting, Thomas returned to the West Wing. Andre sat in the hallway, holding a soda can, eyes deep in thought. You know, Andre said, Linda told me today she once dreamed of an old man walking through walls, holding a notebook with the names of everyone who'd been forgotten. She said the man didn't shout, didn't slam tables. He just wrote until no one could deny the truth anymore. Thomas sat beside him. Sounds a lot like what I'm doing, he said. Andre looked at him. For the first time, that look wasn't just sympathy, it was trust. Who are you really? Thomas didn't answer, but his hand rested on the notebook in his jacket pocket. And inside that notebook, each page was starting to carry the weight of a silent indictment. The winter rain over Louisville didn't come in a downpour. It trickled steadily, drop by drop, but lasted 3 straight days, as if someone up high was deliberately keeping the sky in a foggy state. Inside Helix Robotics, that fog began to creep into the system, not through leaky ceilings or frayed wires, but through unexpected fragments of memory showing up in places no one anticipated. On Monday morning, a sheet of A4 paper suddenly appeared on the internal bulletin board on the first floor, typically a spot for dull shift notices and inventory schedules. The paper had been pasted over old layers of tape. The bolded headline read, "Do you remember?" Beneath it were 3 black and white photos, one of Dana and the software team beside the prototype robot in 2013, another of the old lab with a whiteboard full of math symbols, and the third, a surprise birthday celebration for Mr. Tom Wakefield, the founder once known as the Gray Builder, for his prematurely silver hair and his habit of hand-building desks and chairs. No one knew who had posted it. No camera recorded it. But within 1 hour, nearly 40 employees passing by had taken a picture. And an hour later, the paper was gone. No one admitted to removing it. But the janitor working the West Wing hallway saw Colin standing before the board for a long time, his hand clenched. What seemed like a harmless prank triggered an unexpected domino effect. A young engineer from the testing group, only 6 months on the job, shared that his father had worked at Helix during its early days. He still kept a mug printed with the words, "We build from dust." That same day, a young logistics worker named Ruby posted a short status on the internal network. "I don't know who Mr. Tom was, but if he once believed technology could be kind, maybe we should ask why it no longer is." The post was taken down within 30 minutes, but not before receiving over 60 likes, a record for a non-management post. In the shadows of the West Wing, Thomas watched these ripples unfold with caution and emotion. He didn't do much, just uploaded another excerpt from Dana's notes to the Echo server, titled, "Those Without Names, the Errors Left Unfixed." The second audio recording of Dana was included, her voice more tremulous this time. "If I disappear after this email, know that I'm not afraid. I just don't want the future of technology to be built on names erased from history." 2 days later, Linda walked into the technical room with a small envelope, placing it on Thomas's desk. "I found this in Dana's old cabinet. One of the new hires who's leaving discovered it. They didn't know who to give it to." Thomas opened it. Inside was a quarter-folded sheet of paper containing Dana's hand-drawn internal culture map of Helix, a circular diagram with 3 layers: passion, kindness, truth. In the lower corner, a note in red pen read, "Remove the core, and the outer layers will collapse." Thomas knew it was time to revive that core. That night, in the employee break room, at exactly 2:45 a.m., something strange happened. Andre, usually reserved, suddenly stood up with a paper coffee cup in hand and spoke aloud to the room. "I don't know if you all remember Dana, but I do. She once saved me from an electric hazard. No report, no drama. Just said, we've got to keep each other safe because no one else will do it for us." The room fell silent. Then Ruby stood up. "My dad used to talk about Mr. Tom, said he was the only boss who knew everyone's name in the plant. Now I think maybe he's still around somewhere." Another technician added, "I once found a document signed by Dana in the system's archive. It didn't match what we were taught about the inspection process. I think someone's trying to hide things." Colin heard about the gathering through a report from Brent, and the next morning, an order was issued. Scan all internal emails from the past 4 days, filtering for keywords Tom, Dana, Wakefield, and Echo. But they couldn't block memories. Thomas didn't wait. He initiated the next step. From an old offline copy of Helix's internal newsletter dated 2012, he extracted his final official interview as CEO. The article included a passage, "We don't build robots to replace humans, but to rekindle the dignity of work. Whether you're an engineer, a janitor, or a barista, if you care, you are the heart of Helix." He printed that excerpt and quietly taped it to the door of the technical restroom, the most frequented spot each shift. No name, no logo, but enough to stir a time that had been distorted by unfamiliar suits. Friday morning, Andre stepped into the technical room, eyes gleaming with curiosity. "What are you doing, man?" Thomas looked up, asking the question again. Andre nodded, then leaned in and whispered, I don't know why you came here, but I'm starting to think maybe you didn't come to clean. Maybe you came to wake something that's been buried too long. Thomas didn't reply, but he knew if everything moved in rhythm, he wouldn't need to say a word. Those once dismissed would tell the story themselves. And once memory was reignited, truth would no longer need to shout. It would stand on its own. Monday, 4 a.m. In the hallway of the West Wing, no one spoke, but everyone knew something was moving, quietly, like a faint electric hum inside the walls. Not seen, not heard, but unquestionably real. The night before, Echo Server received 42 logins in a single night. A number never seen before, far beyond what Thomas had expected. But the noteworthy detail wasn't the count, it was the content. The messages no longer recounted fragmented memories of the past. They had taken on a new tone, small but decisive calls to action. We have to speak up. If one person dares, others will follow. Helix wasn't born to become a nest for manipulators. Who really wrote the first lines of code? An anonymous technician, under the username Watcher9, attached a photo of the original operating system log, a document that listed the names of Helix's 6 founding members, with Thomas Wakefield at the top. The photo was taken from a 2011 internal file that had been scrubbed from all company servers. Who kept it? No one knew. But when Thomas saw the image, he understood. Memory never dies. It just needs a sliver of light to return. And that light was growing wider. On Tuesday morning, an anonymous email was sent to the entire operations group. It read only, "Who built Helix?" No signature, no logo, just one line, and yet it stirred a buzz through the entire technical department. The newer hires didn't understand, but the veterans, even the longtime night shift security guards, began telling stories. Tales passed through whispered conversations, over coffee mugs, in brief shoulder taps between shift changes. The momentum wasn't driven by social media. It came from everything that had not been said, and that silence gave it weight. Colin didn't waste time responding. The next day, he called an emergency supervisors meeting and rolled out a series of new protocols. Review all internal camera footage from the West Wing and break rooms. Temporarily suspend any employee who had sent external emails within the past 30 days. Deny all requests for access to archive personnel files. Remove all unapproved bulletin board posts. Linda was the first to be summoned for a personal discussion. No one knew the details, but when she returned, her eyes were red. She said nothing, but Andre later shared, she sat alone in the break room for almost an hour, clutching an old ceramic mug that read, "Founding Spirit." That mug, a 2012 gift designed by Thomas himself for employees who proposed innovations to Helix's early robots, hadn't been seen in years. Just a few hours later, something unprecedented occurred. Andre was suspended. The official reason? Unauthorized interference with the shift rotation schedule. A flimsy excuse, but just enough to intimidate. In the break room, the mood turned suffocating. Ruby, who had once shared a story about her father, was reassigned to the component cooling zone, a place where no one spoke to anyone. A young engineer was transferred to the backup warehouse for allegedly leaking system information. Each move was like a small cut, one that didn't bleed but over time created a slow internal collapse. But Colin made one crucial mistake. He pushed too fast. And in his panic, he revealed what should have remained hidden. He sent an all-staff night shift email threatening, "Report all suspicious behavior, including your coworkers." This email was screenshotted, and somehow it appeared in Echo Server just 20 minutes later. Attached was the first message bearing a real name. "My name is Carlos Rivera. I'm not afraid to speak the truth. The man currently mopping floors in the West Wing is not an ordinary janitor. He was once the creator of this place, and I believe he didn't come back to be thanked. He came back to restore the values someone tried to erase." The message was sent at 3:12 a.m. By 3:45, the entire Echo server was cut off. Inside the technical room, Thomas was still reviewing messages when his laptop flashed. "Server unreachable. Access blocked." He sat in silence for a few minutes. Not angry, not defeated, because he knew this would happen eventually. But the fact that Colin had taken action, personally, aggressively, and without knowing who was watching, had triggered the final phase of Thomas's plan. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was the original founding charter of Helix Robotics, dated 2009, legally stamped and signed by all founding members. And there, under Clause 4.3, was a provision few had ever seen. In the event the internal supervisory system violates the right to free feedback, the primary founder reserves the authority to convene an emergency council, request a formal hearing, and enforce temporary personnel measures, if deemed necessary, to protect the ethical identity of the organization. Thomas had never made this clause public. He hoped it would never need to be used. But now he folded the envelope, slipped it back into his coat, and stepped out into the hallway. It was 4:06 a.m. No music, no spotlight. But every step he took, every person who saw him, tilted their heads slightly in acknowledgement. No questions, no whispers, but they knew. The earthquake had begun. And this time, it wasn't triggered by an explosion. It was driven by a silence too powerful to ignore. Wednesday, 9 a.m. The entire third floor of Helix Robotics, the so-called executive fortress, suddenly received an email with the subject line, Urgent Meeting Request. Clause 4.3, Founding Charter of Helix Robotics. Sender, Thomas Wakefield. The main conference room, once the very space where Thomas had held his first discussions with angel investors 16 years ago, was dead silent. Brent, Kyle, Colin, and two representatives from the investment board sat stiffly in the leather chairs lining one side of the long table. No one joked. No one moved. On the table sat a printed copy of the original charter, with Clause 4.3 highlighted in red. The door opened. Thomas walked in. No more faded janitor uniform. He wore a simple gray coat, a plain white shirt, black shoes. Nothing flashy, but formal. In his hands, a folder. He didn't look around, didn't introduce himself. He pulled out a chair, sat at the head of the table, and spoke. Thank you for coming. I'll keep it brief. The room remained still. Colin, who had been sitting upright like a statue, cleared his throat. I don't understand. You're a janitor. You have no authority to convene. Thomas opened the folder and pulled out a printed document, the original founding contract of Helix Robotics, notarized. I am the founder of this company. I signed the charter you all tried to erase from the system. I am Thomas Wakefield, and I didn't come here to listen to excuses. Kyle leaned back slightly. Brent blinked, but said nothing. Thomas pulled out a USB drive. This contains the full recordings of Dana Lawson, former head of the software team, who discovered that, in 2017, Helix deliberately removed the error-checking function from the AI used in mass production. It also contains version 3.2 of the restructuring plan, which clearly outlines the targeted elimination of staff deemed not media-compatible, including 6 of the 8 founding team members who built the core technology of Helix. He slid the file across the table toward Brent. You signed Dana's termination order, not because she was incompetent, but because she refused to bow. You called it restructuring. I call it cowardice. Collins shot up from his seat. You can't. Thomas locked eyes with him. I can, and I will. I've been silent long enough, watching what you've done to this place. I had hoped Helix would grow up. Instead, it was warped, turned into a machine for profit and control. That ends now. He took out a yellow envelope from his case. This is the official order to reinitiate the Ethics Committee, a legal structure embedded in the charter but unlawfully suspended. I've just signed it. And as the founder, under Emergency Clause 4.3, all executive power is now temporarily transferred to a neutral council for a 48-hour internal review. He turned to the investment board. You may consult your legal counsel. I followed proper procedure. No one across the table moved. Brent lowered his head. Kyle sighed. Colin clenched his fists, face red with fury, but said nothing. The investment board, after a few short phone calls, confirmed the founding charter was still valid, and under its terms it could not be overturned without unanimous consent from all founding members. And the rest had long lost their voting rights. Thomas stood. I didn't come back for revenge. I came to clean house. This time I'm cleaning for real. Not the floors, but the rot embedded in this company's culture. As he walked past Colin, he stopped. I saw how you treated people like Linda, Andre, Ruby, as if they were dust to be swept away. But let me tell you, they're the only reason Helix hasn't collapsed. Not because they obeyed, but because they still believed in the thing you tried to bury. Colin tried to respond, but no words came out. One day later, an official memo from the interim director's office was circulated company-wide. Helix Robotics is undergoing a full review of its personnel policies, internal feedback systems, and ethical charter. Anyone who was denied an opportunity for speaking up, please step forward. We need to hear the truth again. Andre was invited back to work, this time offered a position on the Internal Reform Advisory Board. Linda accepted a new role as coordinator of the Helix Memory Project, tasked with reviving the company's original values. Ruby was nominated to join the internal communications team to help retell the stories of those who had once been silenced. And Thomas? He accepted no title, asked for no office. He only requested to keep a single old wooden chair in the corner of the technical room, where he had once sat to mop his first broom, where he knew that dusty shoes were the real symbol of a builder. From that chair, he wrote an open letter and pinned it to the factory's main bulletin board. I didn't return to reclaim glory. I returned to prove that a company is not defined by its profits, but by how it treats the most vulnerable. If Helix is still worthy, it must be rebuilt from memory, not from financial reports. 3 days after the reckoning meeting, something had shifted at Helix Robotics. Not because new rules were announced, not because someone got fired or promoted, but because, for the first time in years, people began to look at each other as human beings, not as ID numbers, job titles, or pay grades. No one ordered this shift, but the silence that had long ruled the factory hallways had been broken, not by loudspeakers but by grateful glances, by a quiet nod exchanged between two workers who once didn't dare speak in front of the surveillance cameras. Forgotten names, Dana, Miguel, Jenna, were mentioned again in group meetings, not as ghosts unspoken, but as pioneers never rightfully honored. Thomas still worked in the West Wing, no longer in a technician's uniform, but he kept his routine, arriving early, leaving late, always carrying the old mop, not to clean the floor, but to remind himself that if he had once returned through the back door, he would also leave through it, upright. He held no executive power, nor did he want any, but everyone understood. That man was the only moral axis Helix had ever truly known. On Monday morning, employees on the first floor discovered sealed envelopes placed inside each of their lockers. No sender name, but everyone knew who it was from. Each envelope contained a handwritten letter in blue ink with slanted handwriting, each one uniquely written for its recipient. Andres began, "You don't know this, but years ago I told our first investor that if this company ever had 10 people like you, Helix would never lose its wings." Linda's read, "I remember your shoes from the first day I checked the floors in Section C. You were the only one who never missed a shift, rain or snow. Now it's time for you to rest a few days and let me mop for once." Ruby's was shorter. "Your father once sent me an email back in 2015. He wrote, 'I don't know how to code, but I taught my daughter how to write kindness through action.' Thank you for continuing that story." There were 16 letters in total. No one threw theirs away. Some laminated them and pinned them to their desks. Some made copies and passed them around like sacred keepsakes. But no one saw Thomas that afternoon. When Andre asked, the security guard replied, "He left at 5:12 p.m., like always, but he carried a wooden box with him." Inside the technical room, on the wooden desk in the corner, a blue folder was left behind, along with a small note, "No longer a legacy, this is a beginning." Inside was the complete draft design of a new project, Echo Project, an open-source employee feedback system for small and medium enterprises. No brand, no copyright, free to use. At the top of the document was a single line, "If one person can hear the truth in silence, then a community can speak what is right without needing to shout." A week later, in an abandoned warehouse on the south side of the city, a group of engineers, former workers, and Helix employees gathered. Not for a party, but to restart. Donna, the woman once forced into silence, appeared in an old shirt with the original Helix logo. Miguel arrived late, still wearing oil-stained gloves. Jenna brought her old laptop, which held the original safety inspection system. On the wall hung a whiteboard with a slogan written in red marker. "We build from dust. Again, but this time for everyone." Thomas wasn't there, but no one doubted he was somewhere nearby, watching from afar, like a craftsman realigning a wheel's axle, then stepping back so the train could move on its own. The next day, Helix's internal network published a short announcement. Helix Robotics is officially partnering with the Echo project to develop a new, open, transparent, and equitable feedback platform. All contributions, whether from engineers or janitors, will carry equal value. No founder's name was mentioned, but everyone who read it felt a small ache in their chest, and then a quiet warmth. By Friday evening, Linda stood in the hallway, holding a cup of hot tea. She turned to Andre and asked, "Do you think he'll come back again?" Andre smiled. "I think he never really left. He just paused at the right moment so we could learn how to keep going." The breeze drifted through the corridor. The old photo of the founding team, reposted by someone and quietly taped to the bulletin board, was still there. No one took it down anymore. The last day of March. No one at Helix Robotics remembered anything special about it. There was no anniversary, no internal memo. No one took time off or held any surprise meetings. Everything ran as usual. The assembly lines ran on time, the shift schedules stayed unchanged, and the watered-down coffee was still served promptly at 10 a.m. But 60 miles outside Louisville, in a small suburban area, inside a converted warehouse now serving as a community hub, a group of people gathered around a long wooden table. None of them wore ties or ID badges. Some wore torn jeans, some in warehouse uniforms, some still with paint-splattered gloves. At the center of the table stood a small whiteboard with the words, "First Session, the Echo Collective." No cameras, no live streams, no press. And no one knew that the man sitting silently at the end of the table, who hadn't said a word for most of the session, once led one of the fastest-growing tech companies in America. Thomas didn't introduce himself. He simply wrote his name like everyone else. Tom, logistics volunteer. He only spoke 3 sentences the entire meeting. The first was when a curly-haired young man asked, "How do we make sure what we're building doesn't become as corrupted as the systems we came from?" Thomas replied, "We don't need perfection. We just need to make it safe for someone to say, 'I think this is drifting,' without being afraid of losing their job." The second came when a single mother raised her hand and said she had been removed from a tech project for speaking up too much. Thomas said, "You didn't speak too much. They listened too little." The third came when the session ended, and people thanked him for coming. He simply said, "Don't thank me. Wait for the day someone new walks in, sees this place, and asks, 'How did you build something like this?' On that day, don't mention my name. Tell them about each other." That afternoon, Thomas wandered alone down the red brick corridors of the community center, pausing to look at newly hung photographs, images of technicians, maintenance staff, machine operators, and janitors sitting at the same table, drafting a new ethical operations charter. There were no CEOs, no executive titles, only people who had once been pushed to the margins, now sitting at the center. Outside in the courtyard, a young boy was drawing with chalk on the concrete ground. Seeing Thomas, he asked, "What do you do here, mister?" Thomas paused, sat down beside him. "I clean up a little." "You're a janitor?" He smiled. "Yeah, but not the floors. Just the things people leave behind because they're too afraid to pick them up." The boy nodded, not fully understanding, and went back to drawing. That evening, when Thomas walked out of the center, no one saw him off. No one needed to. In his hand was a small notebook, his old CEO journal, but now filled with new notes. Not expansion strategies, names. Names of people who had once been left behind, dismissed, or unheard. He paused at the front steps, looking toward the dark road ahead. There was no moon, no stars, but far in the distance, in the darkness, a soft light glowed from a single home, where a small group of workers were meeting to draft a proposal on transparent wages for new hires. He smiled. Nothing more was needed. His final step on that concrete ground made no sound. But years later, people would still whisper, "There was once a man who dared to bend down and listen." And because of that, we all stood tall again. If you've ever been left out for being different, if you've ever worked quietly without being seen, if you've ever been denied simply because you didn't shout, then this story is yours. And if you believe kindness, humility, and fairness are worth sharing, send this video to someone who needs to be reminded that their worth doesn't come from a title, but from how they treat others. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the stories where justice doesn't need to scream, but still makes the whole world stop and listen. Undercover boss, shotgate your quiet power, reclaim dignity, story that matters, janitor, respect.